Gonzalez, this is the first time we have such a huge effort from the UNDP, a facility to coordinate 6 countries, Syria plus the 5 countries that are most affected. Can you tell us a little bit about what the UNDP facility does?
Yeah, well, there are so many reasons to think about that this crisis is a quite an unprecedented crisis. We are quite close to the Kuwait III conference, and when we look at the figures and the financial ask to address this crisis, we immediately realize that this is something new. Kuwait III is going to be the UN largest ever appeal for a single crisis. But what is still more important is not just the financial ask and the figures, is the type of crisis that we have. In the Syria crisis is in fact the biggest displacement of population that we have, in the sense that the 12 million of people displaced, the Syrian displaced population, they are either refugees or displaced population. The numbers when we compared the Kuwait III with Kuwait II, the numbers of people in need has increased 12 times in Syria. And
this is one of the things I wanted to ask you. How has the crisis evolved from Kuwait I to Kuwait III? Because it's a much different kind of crisis now.
Yeah, exactly. What we realized in Kuwait II 1 year ago is that this is not just a humanitarian crisis, it's also a development crisis. When we look at the impact of this huge demographic shock in terms of refugees, and when we look at the impact of the war inside Syria, we immediately realize that let's say insecurity has affected regional trade, insecurity has affected private and public investment, and this has also aggravated unemployment in the region. We are talking about an average of 25% of youth unemployed. So it means, and the important fiscal impact of this presence of refugees in host countries. So, and if we add the problems related to insecurity, radicalization and terrorism in the region, so we immediately conclude that this is a humanitarian, but it's also a development crisis. So it means that it requires a long-term approach. It seems that we need to change the way that we address humanitarian and development needs. And in Kuwait III, the United Nations and donors, we are going to present a new approach, a new call for actions that means reinforcing the humanitarian efforts. It implies, for example, to add into the let's say, in terms of dealing with water tracking, we can now engage in water extraction and helping communities to get water in their communities. In terms of food assistance is to enhance food production in neighboring countries. In terms of creating, let's say, to avoid the creation of parallel system, we can support municipalities to become self-reliant. So it's a new approach in which the United Nations development groups, it means the UN agencies working on development, now after the Kuwait III, they will have a quite important role. Kuwait III is offering for the first time the opportunity to governments in the region to come up with national plans, what we call national plans. The Regional Refugee and Resilience Plan is a new is quite an innovative way of engaging governments in the region in addressing humanitarian needs, but also long-term development needs.
So now we're talking about resilience building and not just a humanitarian response. Are we changing frames, and what does that entail?
Yeah, resilience is more than jargon. Resilience means supporting local system, is supporting municipalities in dealing with this demographic shock, is supporting even the private sector in the response to the crisis, in generating employment. Resilience means also linking the most immediate needs with national priorities. So what we call resilience is in fact a new business model that take advantage of the existing humanitarian efforts, but let's say bring a sort of a sustainable response. And of course, in the case of neighboring countries, it implies an active role of local authorities and governments. We cannot talk about resilience and development without engaging the governments in neighboring countries. So it's a big change. We always say that this crisis is not just challenging conflict resolution processes. No, we have 4 years of crisis, but it's also challenging the way that we collectively address a crisis. Now, with the participation of development agencies, with the participation of the Kuwait Development Fund, with the participation of the Islamic Development Bank, so we try to complement the remarkable work of humanitarian community by bringing more development capacities, technologies, and resources. So this is a protracted crisis, an unprecedented crisis that is requiring from us unprecedented response.
We're seeing a massive amount of funding pledged, but is this funding actually reaching those in need on the ground?
Well, Kuwait II remains still with a gap. So we couldn't reach the global ask. And what is interesting is that from the total of pledges, almost 90% of the total of pledges that were committed. So what we expect in Kuwait III is to improve, let's say, this performance in terms of resource mobilization, and of course that the international community is able to bring also development resources, because now we are not just addressing to the most immediate humanitarian needs.
Mr. Gonzalez, one last question. Do you have hope for a resolution? And even if this crisis is resolved today and the fighting stops, what still needs to be done for Syria to be rebuilt and the neighboring countries as well?
Yeah, when we talk about a protracted crisis, we need to take into account that this is a crisis as a result of a conflict. So it means that even if we have peace in Syria, we are not expecting a voluntary repatriation of people like in a tsunami, that you can openly call communities to go back home and rebuild their household and livelihoods. In the case of Syria, we know that refugees, they're going to stay more time than expected, and even if we have peace in Syria, this going back home is going to be complex, because after a conflict we need to address issues related to trust, issues related to security, to property, property of land, property in terms of housing. So the crisis now requires a new business model. It requires a new way of combining humanitarian and development efforts. But what is important to take into account is that beyond all of this, let's say this new response that tomorrow will be presented at Kuwait III, this new response will not replace the real solution, which is a political solution in Syria.
Mr. Gustavo Gonzalez, Development Coordinator for the Sub-Regional Response Facility of the UNDP. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you.